was supposed to initially, but I think. And Miller's also. It was flashing, isn't it?
Well, they got all the stuff downloaded with no money to repair. You know, when you see the number 10 in Almar Homestead, and then think about all these people just around the corner
There you
that
go.
are clearly have shoes.
All right. No, my kids used to have those shoes that when you step, they light up. I thought maybe it was your shoes. I'm like, what could be flashing? Better? We got 2 minutes.
We're going to start right on time and catch all the lollygaggers. As someone who was habitually late all my life for just about everything, it's so out of step with me, but I made it on time, so if I can, everyone else should be able to, I guess. All right, my name is Adam Vaughn, known to many of you as a former city councillor and also member of parliament. And with my colleague, Dwight Drummond, we used to work together at City TV, not at CBC. I'll introduce him in a couple of seconds, but I'd like to begin with the land acknowledgement to recognize the territory which we stand on. And of course, we know that this is the land who's under covenant with the Mississaugas, the New Credit. They have the treaty rights to this part of Toronto, in this part of Ontario and Turtle Island. But they have shared stewardship of this land with the Haudenosaunee, as well as the Huron-Wendat peoples. And just as that implies a gathering of different people from different parts of Turtle Island and around the world, we know that with Spadina Avenue, which is an Ojibwe word, Ishpatina, we know that with Takaranto, which is a Mohawk word, which means the place where people gather, where the trees are in the water, that this part of the world has always been a spot where people gather to share good words, to share ceremony, and to chart a course of a common future. And tonight, as we provide that land acknowledgement, I think we can respect the spirit of the soil which we stand and think about creating a better future together with wise words and good counsel, but also with respect and appreciation for all the voices that are here in this room and beyond this room, as this is now being shared on different platforms at the U of T, including the CBC. And so welcome to all of you who are at home. Welcome to those of you who ventured from your homes. And with that, I'll introduce Dwight Drummond, who, up until when we first started this conversation, he was the host of the 6 o'clock news at the CBC, amongst other things. But I guess he can now introduce his new job and introduce himself. We're in your hands for the evening.
Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Adam Vaughn, ladies and gentlemen. There we go. Thank you. I'm now the host of Canada Tonight, filling in for Janella Massa, who's going on mat leave. So instead of yelling at Mayor Tory all the time, I get to yell at Mr. Trudeau for the next little while. So just switching up the focus a little bit. Tonight we're focused on our new powers legislation coming to Toronto and Ottawa. We have an esteemed panel here to talk about these new powers. We figured if we're going to be talking about the mayor's new powers, why not have the former mayors of Toronto to discuss it, because they would know better than anybody. And kind enough to join us tonight, we have, of course, John Sewell, David Crombie, Art Eggleton, Barbara Hall, and David Miller. Art Eggleton is going to join us via video, and so will Mr. Miller, who will spend the evening with us. Now, how is this going to work? That's what we're talking about tonight. Centralized executive power to override council decisions. That's what your new mayor is going to have. Veto bylaws approved by council, they believe, conflicts with provincial priorities. Now, this veto is tied specifically to provincial government interests. Approve and remove high-level staff, like the city manager and department heads, draft and table the budget, create or reorganize municipal departments, choose the chairs of committees and boards, including health and police, more closely oversee the day-to-day operations of our city government, and unilaterally direct city staff to develop policy and proposals for council to consider. That is a big difference from what we have right now in our city, in both Toronto and Ottawa. So, are these new powers needed? That's the big question that we're here to talk about tonight. And we're going to start with our former mayor, Mr. Art Eggleton, who is joining us via video. I understand he is up before David Miller, who I see in the video right now. Hey, David, good to see you. Thank you for joining us. Is Art with us? Because if not, I'm going to start with the folks in front of me, and then we'll switch up. Hey, there we are.
I can't
Excellent,
join
excellent. There he is.
my former mayor colleagues and all of you on this important discussion. But I thank Adam Vaughn and the U of T School of Cities for giving me this opportunity to express a few remarks. We former mayors came together not too long ago to oppose this legislation that has been rammed through by the provincial government, the Ford government, without due process, without community consultation, and not surprisingly, it wasn't part of the election campaign that was recently held. The legislation now passed is both unnecessary and a threat to local democracy. It's unnecessary, I find. I spent 11 years as mayor of Toronto, 1980 to 1991. And I didn't feel I needed that kind of a measure. Well, I had to go and sell my program and policy ideas to city council and get a majority. And in most cases, what I put forward, which I felt was strongly evidence-based, did get support of council. Sometimes different members of council made up the majority. But yes, it's a little bit of extra work, but I think it's well worth it. It helps ensure that all the voices in City Council are coming into play on this decision making. I say it's a threat. Well, it's a threat to local democracy because you add additional powers to one person, taking it away from others on City Council, taking it away not only from the councillors, but from the people that they represent in their respective constituencies. And also, it is all to do the provincial government's bidding, whatever that may be from time to time. What they want to have, that's what they want the mayor to use the power for. Now they call the legislation the Strong Mayor's Building Housing Act. Well, it seems to have a relationship to building housing. But what kind of housing are they talking about? We have a great affordability problem in Toronto, and we need affordable housing as part of that solution. But I hear very little coming from them on that. And particularly, how much are they going to put into the pot to help build this kind of housing? Well, this is bad legislation, and some may say, well, what about a challenge to the courts? Well, some of us, former mayors, did that a year or so ago after the last bill done by the province, again without consultation or due process, to reduce the size of Toronto City Council. And we were close with the Supreme Court of Canada decision, but not close enough to be successful. So I'm putting my attention on what I will call watchfulness. First of all, under watchfulness, the mayor should promise, the council should ask him to promise, and people going to the polls in the coming election should ask all the mayoralty candidates, and I'm not talking about anybody in particular when I say mayor, whoever the mayor may be, he or she, I'm saying that they should only use such powers, if they're going to use them, in the best interest of the city, not at the whim of what the provincial government wants. The mayor should also be promising always to seek a majority support from city council first on any staff or committee appointments or the budget or whatever. The mayor is able, he or she is able to use the extra powers for subsequently. And finally, there is a need for transparency in any of the uses of this power. Local city councillors and resident ratepayer associations should hold the mayor accountable whenever the additional power is used. and challenge the mayor in full public view wherever they feel that abuse occurs. So I think you should consider a very aggressive program of watchfulness on the use of this legislation. Otherwise, it can be very detrimental to the ability of city council and the citizens of this city to be able to control their future. And I thank you very much for this opportunity.
Yes, and thank you to former Mayor Art Eggleton. He's unable to join us tonight throughout the evening, so that's why we gave him a little extra time to do his opening statement. So sorry, you guys will have less, but you'll have all night to talk about this issue. Next up, we'll go to Mr. Sewell.
Thank you. Well, democratic institutions in Toronto have been under attack for the last 25 years. It started when the provincial government, Mike Harris, out of the blue, announced he was going to amalgamate the 6 municipalities in Metro Toronto and create the mega city. People objected very strongly to it. There were referendum held in each of the 6 cities in early 1997, and the vote was overwhelming against the mega city. There's a record vote turnout. 76% of the people voted against the mega city. Harris said, oh, there's a silent majority in favor, I'm going ahead. That's when people realized they had lost their say in the city and its institutions. But then, of course, he went further. He immediately started to kill the subsidies to the Toronto transit system. The province used to pay 50% of operating costs. That was gone. He killed the subsidies to the rent geared to income housing in Toronto. There are about 40,000 units. He killed that. Those 2 subsidies have to be paid by the city of Toronto and a bunch of other things. So the city was hobbled financially at the same time. He also, by the way, reduced welfare payments by 22%. Nothing like kicking people when they're down. So that happened. Since then, provincial governments have done very, very little to actually change those financial arrangements. So as we know, the city is in extraordinary financial trouble. Next year, I think they're talking we're $800 million short on balancing the budget. Then, of course, it has been mentioned in 2018, out of the blue, again, the provincial government under Premier Ford reduced the size of council from the 47 that had been arranged by the council after a lot of consultation, approved by the Ontario Municipal Board, approved by the Ontario courts. He cut it to 25. Again, making it very clear to people their opinions didn't matter. And now, of course, he's gone further. He's introduced, again, without any consultation, without any notice, the Strong Mayors Act, where basically he's saying city councillors should have none of the powers they used to have about appointing committee chairmanships, of creating the budget, of appointing senior staff, all those things. So the provincial government is really after disabling democratic institutions in the city. And you look around and you think, why isn't the election interesting? Well, part of it is, I think people said, it doesn't matter how we vote. Provincial government's going to wipe it away from us, and that's a problem. So we're facing the same kind of problem that Hong Kong's facing, where you don't have any say in what's going on locally. And for some reason, that sort of, everybody said, well, Hong Kong's a problem, but they don't talk about Toronto that way, and they should be talking about Toronto that way. We're in very, very serious trouble. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sewell. We'll go to Mr. Crombie next. And you know what? Council, as Mr. Sewell pointed out, currently has most of these new mayoral powers already. It's been taken away from them.
Thanks very much, Dwight. Like the others, when I saw the legislation coming down, I thought, well, it's more difficulty coming, as John has pointed out, that we've had for the last couple of years. But I tried to find out the best way in which to measure the legislation that they were bringing down. And it seemed to me the best way to do that was to remember the principles that have animated and shaped City Hall and city democracy over these many years. For simplicity's sake, they amount to three. The first is that council is supreme. Whatever else there might be with committees and task forces and so on, at the end of the day, it's the democratic council that determines it, and it is supreme. Secondly, the council receives its advice from an independent civic service. And therefore, it's really important that that civic service be understood professionally to be independent. And thirdly, the requirement for the city, the city hall and the city council to do its business in public is essential, and one in which it requires the mayor as a consequence. The mayor to be accountable to the council and to the public, and not to some external or outside body or agency or government. Those three principles have been with us for a very long time, and it's brought good government and bad government. It's done good things and some bad things. But the fact of the matter is, it allowed this city to progress in a way that it brought the citizenship with us, its citizens with it. And it seems to me that now we've got presented to us a situation with the new legislation where clearly they're trying to weaken the council and undermine those principles, which is why it needs to be resisted. Which brings me to my final point, and that is that I looked at the legislation and it's mostly permissive, except for a couple of things required in the budget part. All the other stuff is permissive, all the suggestions being made. That it's up to the council and the new mayor, or the council and the mayor, after the election, to determine what they're going to do with that legislation. So while I'm like John and others concerned about where they've been, I really want to focus on where we can go. And where we can go is to make sure that the mayor, the new council and the mayor is an early item on the business after the election, determine what they are going to do with this legislation, because that will tell us a lot about the council and the mayor.
Thank you. I have a feeling I'm going to have to play devil's advocate tonight. I really am. Former Mayor Hall, it's not always easy to seek consensus on council, right? And instead of seeking consensus, the mayor can now use these additional executive powers to override or just go around council. So will that not speed things up?
Well, it may speed things up in one sense and slow them down in many other senses. I think, as you know, we were all on council quite a while ago. It was a different city. We were, with the exception of David, of the smaller city of Toronto, a place less than a million. Council in my time as mayor had 16 members, plus 16 councillors plus the mayor. Those 9 votes, one was always looking for number 9. And although there were votes where it was 8-9, I think it's important to realize that the vast majority of votes were unanimous, where there wasn't a lot of debate. During the last term of council, I haven't heard of a lot of votes where what the mayor has supported has not been the winning
I think it's just
position.
the rooming houses. He had to defer the vote on the rooming houses. That was the one that he might have lost.
So, I mean, if I think back to my time on council, there are some votes I lost that I really wished I had won, And if I'd had a veto, it might have been tempting to use it, but I'm not sure that would have been beneficial for council. I think that would have created a very different dynamic between the members of council who represent different parts of the city, who come with different issues. I think it would have created division and animosity that would have been very destructive moving forward. I also think about other items where I knew at the beginning of the issue coming forward that I didn't have support of council. But I worked to build that, and I built it significantly by going out to different groups in the community and having them come together and express their view and educate the councillors so that the support came ultimately from council. Two of the issues that I worked very hard on were called the Kings, the development at around King Spadina and King Parliament, which are now vibrant residential and commercial neighborhoods as opposed to abandoned industrial areas at some point. Well, when Jane Jacobs came together with the development sector and the heritage groups and people wanting more residential housing in those areas, council was educated by the people and they supported it. Again, a veto in that situation would have created a long history of animosity and instead of a lot of support for those neighborhoods. So I think, as the others have said, it's important that the new mayor and council take on immediately after election how this is going to work and demand of the mayor that they will not use it without some of the limitations that we've heard already. I think we need to make sure that yet another position or law that the province has made does not further harm our city, as many of the things they have done have created great harm
in the past. Thank you for that, Barbara Hall. We'll head next to David Miller, who's joining us via video. And David, you're originally from that side of the border. I know we stole you here in Toronto, but you know, Chicago and New York, they have these strong mayors. Why not Toronto and Ottawa? Oh, I think you're muted. Yeah, turn off the mute.
I've only been doing this for 2.5 years. You think I'd figure out the mute button by now? Thanks, Dwight, for the question, and my colleagues for their comments. I fully agree, and I thought David Crombie, starting with the principles, put it right. And I'll get to my answer to your question in a second, Dwight. But I think, first of all, I need to say that no mayor of Toronto worth their salt would accept or advocate for the powers that the province has just given them, particularly in the way it's happened. I think the powers are wrong. They're likely to produce significantly adverse results for local democracy, and they've come about in a really malevolent way that's completely undemocratic. You know, there's a magic to municipal government that's very different in provincial and federal government, and I think the magic comes about, certainly in Toronto's case, because the people of Toronto felt the ability to work on issues that they cared about in their neighborhoods and have a real say in partnership with the people they elected, their city councillor and their mayor. And the combination of creating these giant wards in which it's physically impossible for a councillor to actually be at all the local meetings that they would want to be at, with giving the mayor sort of unilateral powers over certain parts of the council agenda, particularly the budget, completely disempowers people from the democratic dialogue about the kind of city they want to live in. And if you go back and look at the polls for the past 40 years, municipal government in Toronto has always ranked far higher than provincial and federal. And I think that one of the reasons for that is this magic of people actually engaging when there's a decision to be made in their neighborhood between elections. It's much more than just voting. It's about actually shaping your neighborhood and your city the way you want. And I think the reason I say no mayor worth their salt would accept these powers or advocate for them is, first of all, because they're tied to provincial priorities, and that's just outrageous. It's completely undemocratic. Why should the province tell the people of Toronto what they want in their city and how to build it? And secondly, because nobody campaigned for this. Nobody has put this democratically to the people of Toronto or even the people of Ontario and said, we want to change this. And it's true that in some US cities, there are systems where, like Chicago, where the mayor has a different role. And it's possible to imagine municipal government being structured in different ways in Toronto. But to do that needs to be done democratically. Somebody needs to campaign on it. Perhaps somebody running for mayor, put your proposal forward and say, this is how it should work. This proposal is, I think, has the worst of everything. It's half-baked. It brings in a very strange kind of provincial mindset to this. And I would argue that the provincial government is the one that needs reforming much more than the city of Toronto. We effectively have a system. Oh, I can't hear applause, but I can see it. Sorry if I talked over the applause. We effectively have a system where the premier, if they have a majority, can do anything they want for 4 years and doesn't have to engage people, doesn't have to have a mandate, can do anything. And unfortunately, although we lost 5-4 in the Supreme Court, the court sort of supported that, even though one could have a powerful argument that in the case of having the council representatives, it was extremely undemocratic, arbitrary, and there was no political mandate for it. So my argument is doing this is going to produce worse results because when voices are excluded from the debate, their needs are not met. And we all know who's going to be excluded. It's going to be people who have the least and the least power. And who's going to be heard? The people who have the most power. The Board of Trade will have a voice in the mayor's office. You know, will the good people in some of our communities, which need to be a priority for investment because they've had little investment over the years, will they have the voice of the year? I doubt it. And so from my perspective, we've got a wrong result, which would be damaging to the long run and short run success of the city of Toronto. And it's been done in the wrong way. In fact, I'd argue that, you know, if there was going to be a veto, the only thing the mayor should have the power to veto is provincial decisions, which are damaging to the city of Toronto. And that might make our chances a bit better to have the kind of city we want.
Thank you, David Miller. And there was some applause, and you did talk over it, but it's okay. They heard you. And for those of you who...
Applause is welcome. And I'm sorry I'm not there in person.
If you want to hear more from David, he started tweeting right as this legislation was passed, and you can just follow along with his tirade as he got very angry at this legislation. I want to look at the specifics in the legislation, but before we get to that, I would like to hear from you what you think of the reasoning that is being claimed behind this, about the slowness of City Hall, and if you think that this will somehow speed things up, and you know you've done the job, you know how it works. What difference? They're saying that they want to speed up the construction of 1.5 million homes in 10 years. They want to speed up the building of critical infrastructure. Is the municipal approval process moving too slow? Is that something that needs to be fixed?
Well, I guess one of the things I'd say to that is that, yeah, I think it does take a bit too long for city staff to review planning applications. But the reason for that is that we don't have enough planning staff because the city doesn't have enough money to actually have a reasonable number of staff. The city has literally been starved of money by the provincial government. And if there's one thing that should be changed is the city should actually have the money to start satisfying its needs, staff needs. So In fact, you can do all the stuff you want about saying the mayor should do all this, but in fact, that's not going to speed up anything at all, in my opinion. You've got to have the staff that are actually going to review applications and do something with them. I think the second thing I'd say about that is, you know, it would be really good to get rid of the Ontario Municipal Board
OMB.
and just, you know, let the city council actually deal with applications. You know, when city now does approve something or not approve something, then goes to the OMB, well, there's another year and a half or 2 years. So in fact, these things are all in the hands of the province. They could be ensuring that city had more money to actually provide reasonable services. And secondly, they could actually get rid of the Ontario Municipal Board or substantially revise how it works to speed decision making. You don't need this legislation to do that.
We'll go to Ms. Hall.
Barb?
Yeah, Ms. next.
I think the increase in the size of the wards has made it almost an impossible job for councillors to deal expeditiously with development applications in their ward, housing applications in their ward. Somebody mentioned the fact that councillors can't get to the meetings they want to get to. So the opportunities for communities to comment on things and have some input and work those things through, I think is much harder because of the changes that the province made.
Through amalgamation.
Yeah, I have the feeling, I don't know this of course, but I have the feeling that the province is really trying to shrug off its own responsibility for housing and imply that somehow if only City Hall was better, we'd get more housing. And that is just wrong. They know that's wrong, and they're, I think, misleading intentionally, I don't know intentionally, but they're misleading us. They're misleading us because if you look at their own housing policy, there's where you'll find the difficulties. It's their housing policy, their inability to come to grips with affordable housing. They like to talk about supply of housing, and that makes the development community quite happy. The development of affordable housing is much harder work, and the province is not doing very much in that regard. It's a lot easier to slough it off and say somehow it's the problem with the city.
David?
Yeah, I agree with my colleagues. Maybe add a couple of points to this. First of all, when the province says it's too slow, I think what they really mean is it's those pesky residents of Toronto who want to have a say over the development in their neighborhoods that are taking all the time. Because, you know, we know from lots of media reports the influence that certain members of the development industry have over this provincial government, and they're whispering to them, you know, you can't build anything because people will stop it, which is not remotely true. You end up with far better developments when people have a say. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I want to pick on John Sewell's point about money. We sort of accept the way these things are, both democratically, that the province somehow knows better, therefore, you know, it's legitimate for it to be arbitrarily changing Toronto's system of governance. And we accept the financial arrangements. But in Toronto's case, first of all, the first point I think is totally wrong, as I said previously. But secondly, in Toronto's case, if you look at the money, there's been lots of studies that show that huge amounts of tax revenue paid in Toronto flow out to support the provincial and federal governments. When I was in office, it was $20 billion a year. Not sure what it is now. That's tax revenue coming from what people and businesses pay in income and sales tax in Toronto that goes to the province and the feds more than comes back to the city. So part of the answer for this, all of this, and perhaps part of the reason the province wants to run this city, because make no mistake, the way this veto is set up, it's about the province running the city. Perhaps some of it is about continuing to control that revenue rather than allowing more of it to come back in the city to ensure the city succeeds. And there's a really good example right here in Toronto of what can happen when the province goes too far, which is with our school boards. You know, our school boards had the power to tax. There were vigorous debates. I remember debates about heritage languages, vigorous debates in elections, resulting in school boards elected or trustees losing around issues like heritage languages. And from time to time, really progressive changes made because the school board controlled the tax revenue. The province took that tax revenue and gives less back in a funding formula. And I think we need to talk about this more. There's plenty of money paid in taxes in Toronto to meet the needs of the city. Unfortunately, the province is the one who decides where that's spent instead of the people we elect. And it's my view that the people we elect should be making those decisions. And I think if they did, we'd see issues like housing, particularly the affordability of housing, addressed in a much more substantial and meaningful way.
Thank you, David. And I think you want to go ahead.
I just had one further little comment. In the time of David and I, we had a lot of community consultation, particularly around building affordable housing, because we built an awful lot of affordable housing in the 70s, an awful lot of it, through City Home. And one of the things we found was that community consultation actually speeded development. We actually managed to be in a position where if you consulted with people and got their consent and worked out the problems, that in fact you got approvals right away. And I'll give you one example of that. We decided we wanted to have group homes throughout the city. We wanted to have them within 1,000 feet of any other group home. You can have a group home anywhere in the city. We did community consultation on that. Susan Fish actually was the one who did it. And at the end of the community consultation, we passed the bylaw. There was not a single objection to take it to the Ontario Municipal Board. Community consultation really helps decision making. And the provincial government is trying to say, oh, it slows things down. That's wrong.
Can you speak to NIMBYism though? Because I've covered stores where people say, not in my backyard, I don't want this housing, it's going to bring down my property values. Do we not run into those situations?
No, I think that if you have good community consultation, you can get around that problem. And that's what we did. We did it all the time, right?
Yeah, our system, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Our system is, those three principles I mentioned earlier, allowed this city to engage the public on an ongoing basis in a series of issues. And it was tough, and it was fights, and people were feeling this way or feeling that way and at one another. But the fact of the matter is, it was debate within the community, and therefore allowed people to feel they were part of the decision making, not just coming from afar.
Barbara.
One of the things around NIMBYism, and there are times when that has slowed things down. And recently, in the last few years, the Human Rights Commission has actually got involved and said that if additional process is applied to an as-of-right application, for example, of social or assisted housing, that is discriminatory. And a number of cities and municipalities across the province have controlled it much more because of that. So the right amount of consultation, but not endless abusive consultation.
And I think you also have to have councillors who are willing to say, I'm going to have serious consultation, and I want to tell you what my values are as we go into this consultation. I mean, I know that, again, back in our day, we would say, want to have affordable housing, how do we have it? So the councillors have to take a strong position, and too often the councillors are not doing that. They're saying, oh, just stand back.
Let's focus on some of the highlights in this new policy. And I'll take a line from one of the city council. I can't remember who said it, but he said it would allow the mayor to make tough decisions when it comes to the budget, calling the process now grinding and grueling. And we'll get to budget. So now, prepare, this is what the new mayor powers would be, prepare and provide budget for council consideration. Council can make amendments based on existing regulations, but the mayor can veto council's proposed amendments, which can only be overridden by a 2/3 majority. So that is how the new system would work. Your feelings on that? On you, as the mayor, getting this budget together and you bringing it to council?
Well, Dwight, can I
let
answer
me-
that
let me
first?
take it.
I think David wants it first, and then
No, I'll defer to David.
No,
and
no, it's
we'll-
all right.
David's going to divert to Dave.
You're a much younger, better looking guy.
Yeah, but I'm not perfect. There's only one of us in the room who's perfect.
I say Mr. Crombie goes. That's nice.
Yeah, go ahead, David.
No, I'm not sure. Say the question again. No, sorry.
We're talking specifically
I
about
was
the
thinking
budget.
about being perfect.
I know. He's distracting you. It is now, the mayor now
Yeah,
can prepare a budget,
yeah.
right? And not only that, the mayor can also veto council's proposed amendments
Oh,
to said
the
budget.
whole flow,
And
yeah.
he can override it now. It needs 2/3 of council to now override the mayor when it comes to that decision.
The more the mayor decides that he's going to take a run at his own council by using a veto, he's going to lose, in football terms, yardage by the mile. Because the best way to get people mad at you is to not include them in your discussion. And so it seems to me that somehow the use of the veto, that is not something that is helpful. The mayor will find out if he uses it, that the veto will become the way in which he divides his council and therefore cuts off the vital debate that John was just
But if he
talking
does divide it, he still wins because it needs 2/3, right?
Well, let me take it to the weeds for a second.
Yeah.
The idea of having a 2/3 vote in order to overcome another
Veto.
vote or veto, that used to be at the old Metro Council, and that was for budgets. But it wasn't the one single person, don't forget, when they had a 2/3, get rid of the vote, by 2/3 vote, you can get rid of the veto. It was done by the executive committee, which was a larger number of people than one person. This idea that somehow you should put all your marbles with one person, you've lost your marbles.
I thought you were going to go there with
Sorry.
that. I knew it.
Well, but I think the other point is that the mayor is going to make sure that he or she has a third of the council on his or her side by offering them plums, committee chairmanships. I mean, it's now the mayor that gets to appoint
I was just
the
gonna say, yeah,
committee
what
chairman,
happens
not
now? Yeah,
committees.
yeah.
So in fact, the chance of the mayor losing on that 2/3 thing is very, very slim, which I think gets to David's point. They're going to have almost half the council furious at you as the mayor. And they are going to put all sorts of barriers in front of what the mayor is doing and cause all sorts of trouble.
It's a superficial win, but at least I think one step further, they'll see it as an opening gate
Yeah,
to a
Pyrrhic
coming
victory.
constant fight.
The suggestion that making the budget would ever be an easy process is ridiculous. I mean, think about our own personal budgets, let alone a city of 3 million where
It's supposed to be grinding and grueling.
where it's meant to be balanced. So what about how you fund all the 800 million things
When you don't have the money.
when you don't have the money?
Mr. Miller?
Yeah, I think this is clearly wrong for the reasons my colleagues have said. Also because it breeds, I think, a lack of trust in the government. Oh, there he goes again. And, when mayor's popular, maybe they get away with it. But I really think it speaks to creating a much bigger disconnect between local government and people. And if you look at politics globally right now, that's really dangerous. And one thing we did when I was in office was we actually brought the budget to neighborhoods with sessions called Listening to Toronto. And what happened was David Signacki, who was chair of the budget committee, my first term as mayor, who, by the way, was a card-carrying conservative, and I'm not, would do a presentation. Councillors were welcome, but they were not allowed to speak or participate. And then people would have roundtable discussions about their priorities. And we tried to funnel those sessions, the listening to Toronto sessions, into the budget, and it was extremely successful. And I regret in some ways that we didn't do that in my second term, because it engaged people in the decision making, so their priorities are reflected. And a budget's not just an academic exercise. You know, should we fund youth programs in an underserviced neighborhood in order to help young people in that neighborhood have a real chance as part of a community safety strategy? Or do we fund police? That's a matter for debate that people might have a different view about. And given that police is the biggest single budget item, you need to have that debate. And people need to see their thoughts reflected in the discussion, even if the debate ends up coming to a different conclusion than they have. That's democracy, and it's a really, really important part of a city council that's gone out the window with this veto. The second thing is it's completely unnecessary. You know, the current mayor didn't lose a budget vote, as far as I'm aware. And the only one I lost was when we brought in the land transfer tax, and it was deferred. And I won it the second time. And that's understandable, because even though I'd campaigned on using the provincial revenue tools, bringing in a new tax like that is a substantive discussion for council, and it was okay to have two kicks at the can. But so, you know, I agree with David Crombie. It will reflect weakness in the mayor, create division at council, but more importantly, a division between council and the people of Toronto that can be extremely negative. You know, the council should represent the collective aspirations of the city. And if voices are cut out of that process, it's no longer reflecting the collective, it's reflecting the aspirations of a few.
Okay, and that's a good segue into the next highlight from this policy. Provincial interest and veto powers bring to a city council meeting for consideration an issue of provincial interest that has been prescribed in regulation by the Lieutenant Governor in council. Veto a bylaw passed by a majority of council on an issue that the mayor deems could potentially interfere with a prescribed provincial priority. Council can override mayor's veto with 2/3 on this one too. If council fails to override the mayor's veto, it cannot be appealed to a court in whole or part because of unreasonableness or supposed unreasonableness of the decision. So you can't take it to court. Once it's done, it's done. What are the provincial interests in that? And this is the one I think that's sticking in a lot of people's craw here. They worry about the mayor working for, I guess, the provincial government and not for the people of the city.
I think it's entirely outside of any kind of tradition in this city that the mayor somehow, his job is to be an agent for the premier or the provincial government. That's not what it is. The mayor's primary responsibility is to the council and to the public of Toronto. And the idea that somehow you can actually organize things so that the mayor now is an agent for the province and speaks for the province in the council and has power to do so, that's wrong. It's simply wrong.
Anybody else want to jump in on that one?
I think David's right.
You hear that? That's he spent a lifetime saying I was wrong.
No, I said that once before. I remember in 1976, I think it was.
Oh, goodness. We will continue on the highlights because we do want to save some time for some audience questions as we continue. City committees and boards. So, the mayor, appoint chairs and vice chairs of city boards, establish and dissolve city committees, appoint chairs and vice chairs of committees. The mayor has had this power delegated by council before, but this would then enshrine it in the legislation. Opinions on that?
I think committees should appoint their own chair. And in our day, that was the case.
Absolutely. And I maybe it was unusual, but I chose never to get involved in when council was choosing its committees or its chairs.
Really? Did all of you do
or
that?
even its executive. No, I did, because I just thought the more I talked, the less I would get. So I just let council decide what it wanted to do, and I would work with whomever council chose. That seemed to me simple and straightforward.
In terms of membership of committees, I think that council did a good job, that they tended to always have a range of views on the committee. I can't think of many times when positions were left off committee. The majority depended on the majority of the council, perhaps, but.
And you kind of already do it anyway. So, David Miller, does this need to be enshrined in legislation, or what does that solve by doing that? Because it sounds like the mayor's already kind of had this. This was already the way things kind of worked at City Hall.
Well, in Mel's time, the mayor had a very strong role in recommending through the striking committee, which council struck. The striking committee would recommend committee appointments and would work on it. And the chair of the striking committee in my time was Deputy Mayor Pantalone. And, you know, I was, or at least my staff were quite involved in that. Ultimately, it was council's decision, though. And, you know, for me, it's another example of this is none of the province's business. You know, why should somebody who represents Sault Ste. Marie or Kingston or Timmins or Niagara Falls be deciding, in effect, the powers of the mayor of Toronto? It makes no sense to me. And the fact that it's this detailed, you know, the mayor can make these decisions, I think is quite abhorrent. And, you know, I echo what David said before. It might seem like a minor point, but it's wrong. It's just wrong. If council wants to abrogate that power to the mayor, and there's a proper process and the people of Toronto engaged, and it's debated and publicly discussed, and the people of Toronto decide this is how the government should work, that's one thing. But if, you know, the people representing those constituencies, in fact, they probably didn't even have a say. This is just the handiwork of the premier, I'm quite sure. So it's arbitrary, it's unnecessary. And, you know, the mayor's the kind of thing where the mayor's best off using their influence rather than having a power for all the reasons David said so eloquently a little while ago.
We will continue with one of the highlights, and I think in about 5 minutes we're going to take some audience questions.
Dwight, do you lose your neutrality if you call them lowlights?
I am trying to stay neutral. I tell people all the time I've been approached by all of the parties to run, so that means they don't really know my politics, and I kind of like it like that. Try to keep it like that. The last one is city staff. This one says, direct city staff to undertake research, appoint chief administrative officer, hire and dismiss heads of divisions or any other part of the organizational structure with a list of exceptions including but not limited to the clerk and deputy clerk, ombudsman, auditor general, medical officer of health, and the chief of police. Is that something that is needed at City Hall?
Again, this is just the wrong thing to do. City has depended on independent staff, and they should continue to be independent. The last thing we want is the mayor and senior staff to be meeting privately and the mayor saying, this is what you're going to have to do on this application.
It's hard enough on staff when the mayor's office has a moral suasion about it that the staff pay attention to. But they take that into calculation with their professional responsibilities. The idea that you're now going to have to pay attention to that one person in order to get ahead with your life, your work life, it's just wrong. It's unacceptable.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I think it also impacts the quality of staff that the city will get if people know that this is a job where they're going to have to answer to one person and can be dismiss the next person who comes along.
The mayor can hire and fire top officials and his executive committee now. Yeah. David, my friend Adam Vaughn likes to say this is and I'm going to finish up with this because we got 2 minutes. He likes to say that this is a solution looking for a problem to fix. Is that your opinion, sir?
Yes. And in fact, Adam Vaughn got that
that is
line from
that
me.
seems to be the consensus we are getting here tonight.
You know, it's incredibly sad to me, actually, that we lost the Supreme Court of Canada case on cutting council in half, and that it was 5-4. And all of us here and Art were interveners. And I applaud John Sewell, who helped bring us together. It was a really important intervention because it stood for some principles about city government mattering and therefore needing some kind of constitutional status. And 4 of the 9 Supreme Court justices got it right. And I think if you add to that the fact that that action was arbitrary, it was right after an election, nobody campaigned on it. The only legitimacy was a technical legal legitimacy that the provincial government, when there was a minority, the premier can essentially do whatever they want simply by rubber stamping things through the legislature that his party controls. And like in this case, there were no public hearings and it happened without public discussion. That's simply wrong. It's just wrong in a democracy. And I don't even think it's a solution looking for a problem, actually, Dwight. I think this is abhorrent, and it really makes me worry about the state of our democracy and the state of our city. Because a city government that was pretty democratic and pretty inclusive and certainly made efforts to involve people in the decisions that affected their lives and neighborhoods is now being turned into one where there is arbitrary power by one person who, the most powerful in our society will have access to and nobody else. And that's a recipe for a city that doesn't meet the needs of people. It's come about in a highly undemocratic way. And I firmly believe if one more justice had voted the other way, and the provincial action in cutting the number of councillors and wards in half had been found to be illegal, we wouldn't have seen this. And that troubles me because that institution is supposed to be protecting our democratic rights. We're 3 million people. We're bigger than most provinces, and there shouldn't be arbitrary changes like this coming from some other government. It's just, as David Crombie says, it's all simply wrong.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. We're going to get to your questions now, and while Adam sets up for that, I want to continue my role as devil's advocate. We do remember our premier used to be at City Hall, right? And we also remember that his brother at one point was mayor and was pushed aside, and council went on to operate around him. Do we feel maybe that some of that is playing into what's happening here a little bit? No, nobody wants to go there. I know the audience is like, you guys all want to go there.
I think the reduction in the number of wards, I think, actions taken right after an election where there was no discussion about the issue says to me this is somebody who's sitting at home or lying awake at night sort of trying to figure out how to get back at, how to make the city like the corporation that he played a role in.
Well,
no understanding of democracy, I think.
Ford might have been the instigator, but at the end of the day, the Conservative Party voted unanimously to support this legislation. Unanimously. So where are all these people coming from? A lot of them have been former city politicians. I mean, I know that I've been relatively close to the mayor of Collingwood. We have a place up near there, and there's a bunch of issues that, sure enough, I've gotten involved in. And over the years, I've been talking to him. So I actually wrote him a letter and saying, so why did you support this legislation? You used to be mayor of Collingwood. Why did you support it? He didn't reply for 3 weeks, and I wrote him another letter. Said, I want to have your answer on this. Or are you one of those MPs that disappears as soon as you get elected? And he wrote me another email. I'll be back to you very shortly with my opinion. That was 2 weeks ago. But that's the point. Those guys are all doing this awful thing. It's not a simple thing of one person doing something. It's one person having an idea and a bunch of fools agreeing with it without any discussion, or without any debate, without any dissent. That's the deficit in democracy that we're facing here in Ontario right now. Oh, I'm going to make one other point. The other point I want to make is that David has mentioned our intervention about the reduction of the councillors from 47 to, I think. In 2018, we had a law called the City of Toronto Act, which said that the organization of council was something that the City of Toronto did. The provincial government forgot about that law and enacted their law to reduce the number of councillors. So they broke the law. I mean, they literally had no respect for the law while they made that change. I mean, this is we're in trouble here, folks. We're in serious trouble.
So we're going to take questions. The staff have been helping grab some of the written questions that you've put down on paper. I'm going to come around and try and find some of you. Holly, where are you? I'm going to come and get you next, but I'm going to start because I don't know where Joanne is, but her question is very simple. So now that you've provided us with your analysis, what do citizens do? Take it away.
Well, let me go back to my introductory remarks at the closing. I wanted to make the point, and want to make the point again, that we have an opportunity. It's not something that we simply have to live with. When the election is over, the mayor and the council, Toronto, the newly elected council and mayor, have an opportunity and should take the opportunity, and we should insist that they take the opportunity to take this legislation and indicate how the council is going to deal with that legislation. As I mentioned earlier, the legislation itself is permissive and allows the council and the mayor to determine what they're going to do. We need to make sure that they address this in the very first part of their mandate. Right after they do the formal stuff, they do the business of the council, they should begin with an understanding, a debate on the council about this legislation, and that should kick off a round of public discussion that we didn't have before. This is a way in which we can have the public discussion we didn't get.
There are still all candidate meetings happening, I think, in this election, although there seem to have been fewer than in many others. So, but that is one opportunity to be there and to give that message strongly, and to tell both candidates for council as well as for the mayor that this is the expectation, and what are their plans for addressing it. I think that it's all very well for us to say they must address it early, but I think we need to make sure that that message continues to come. So all kinds of organizations, resident associations, tenant associations, parent associations, any place that people come together, they need to be communicating that after the election, demanding. I think people need to be going to City Hall Square and with a loud voice about what the expectations are, and it needs to be made clear and it needs to be demanded.
We have questions coming from outside this room and inside this room. Holly has a question. The legislation was propositioned as delivering housing, which is, of course, a central issue to the city's needs, and she has a very particular question about that.
Hiya. My question is essentially so I've lived in a lot of very high-dense cities all around the world, and it kind of surprised me when I moved here to find out that most of Toronto isn't zoned for high-density living. It's zoned specifically for single-family dwellings. So I was wondering how much you think, that is contributing to housing affordability here in Toronto. And that seems to be something that the Toronto City Council could do something about rather than, being a province versus city sort of issue like you've been talking about tonight. Cheers.
I'm happy to speak to that, Dwight.
Go ahead.
So, sorry, Adam. Well, a couple of things on this. First of all, this has nothing to do with housing. It might have something to do with helping developers get their way, and I'm sad to say there is a reported track record of actions that can only be termed as corrupt between this particular provincial government, the development community, over their first mandate. But it's not a thing to do with housing. And there are things that city council can do with housing without a mayoral veto. I think, first of all, with funding, we still need to fix our current Toronto Community Housing Corporation housing and bring it up to appropriate standards, including environmental and energy efficiency. And there needs to be funding for that. And that needs to be a priority of council and of the province, frankly, in allowing more of the money that is generated in Toronto to stay here for that. But secondly, in terms of private sector housing, we have an official plan that is basically at its heart the same as the official plan which was passed in 2003. And it said that one of the objectives was that anyone should be able to live in Toronto without having to own a car. And in order to do that, we needed to ensure that there was significant densification on our main transit lines and LRT lines and streetcar lines. At the time, it didn't mention the LRTs because they're new. But we've got Eglinton, Finch coming in. We have the Bloor Danforth, huge swaths of which aren't dense. And there is a way to build what I would call medium density, 8 to 12 stories along all of those lines, and allow that to happen very quickly. That would make a massive difference to the ability of people to live in Toronto. And I think on affordability, because so many units can be created. And to me, that's one of the big sleeper issues in this municipal election campaign, will the next council have what it takes to work to that kind of vision, where you will take the opportunity, because we have this higher order mass transit, to ensure that housing's built. And from the purchase affordability perspective, that's a really significant part of the solution, and that's entirely within council's power without any mayoral veto whatsoever.
We've just come through a pandemic, still dealing with the dynamics of COVID and other public health issues. The province and the city don't always see eye to eye on public health measures. It's not just COVID that's brought that to the attention, but there's a question here about mask mandates and how they presented themselves as a political issue. What happens when one government says you must wear a mask and another government says it doesn't? Does the provincial policy issue always take precedent?
Is that a question?
That's a question from the audience.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes. Levels of government have their own responsibility, but as you described the question, the province has the power and the responsibility. I might go back to the question about housing. David did a good short run on what could be done. There are a number of factors. The province, just to show the shallowness of their approach to this legislation, they call it about housing. It's not about housing. It's about other things. Whereas when it came to housing, they had their own task force make recommendations dealing with matters that you just raised, and they didn't bother picking it up. So yes, there's things that can be done by revisions in the zoning bylaw, but they're not going to get much help from the province because they back away from it.
Just on the housing point as well, because I think it's so important, and the list of things that need to be done is very, very long. But I know we were talking before the panel started about the fact that in the downtown East End, Cabbagetown kind of area, that there are many rooming house units that are owned by City Home that are boarded up. And there are many, many people sleeping in tents in Allen Gardens and in the ravines along the Don River. And you just look at the boarding and the sleeping in the ravine and say, what's keeping this from being a solution? And it's money, and it's the money that the province has not contributed. And they're now saying that for affordable housing, social housing, they'll require that the charges, development charges, be dropped. So even less money for the city. They're not saying we'll pay that amount. They're saying they'll be dropped, and so make it even harder for the city.
And unfortunately, the city needs all those development charges to try and pay for basic services, which they can't afford right now. I mean, these guys are crazy.
Before I give it over to Ken Gruberg, Richard Yamplowski, where are you in the audience? I will find you next.
Thank you, Adam. First of all, I'm really struck. This is more a comment, and maybe there's a question there, but I'm struck by the unanimity amongst the five of you. It's really quite striking. I'm in a unique position of having worked for 3 of these mayors over 10 years at City Hall and worked informally with the other 2 on great projects like the Kings. And I just wanted to point out 2 really important differences. I also served as chief planner in Boston for a couple of years. I've worked for 4 or 5 US mayors in their cities. And one difference is in those cities, first of all, I never knew the councillors. There was no reason to. It was pointless because every decision was made by the mayor. And that meant kind of disenfranchisement of local government throughout the different neighborhoods in those cities. And I worked for some good mayors and some not so good mayors, but the fact that the councillors were insignificant, I think, was really striking. And I fear that that's what this legislation will do. The second thing has to do with the appointments of senior officials. Having worked for John Sewell, for David Crombie, for Art Eggleton, I was always encouraged to give my professional opinion as a civil servant, never to give a political opinion. In fact, or very explicitly not to give a political opinion. In the American system, it's almost a given that all of my colleagues, heads of departments, would lose their jobs with each election. And not only the top people, but a few layers below. So the idea of continuity, because very few things can really be established in a city in one election cycle. So what it does is it encourages erratic switches from one thing to another, and senior people on the staff side of municipal government who owe their loyalty entirely to the political appointment, and the whole idea of a civil service which is independent, which is one of David Crombie's principles, goes out the window. So I'm just saying that because I think people really have to understand that in addition to all the things that all of you have said, this seriously diminishes the role of a city councillor. I'm struggling to even understand what that role is anymore under this legislation. And it makes the idea of being a civil servant something entirely different from what we have had all these years.
That was great.
Thank you.
I've got that covered.
Well done, Ken.
Oh, you got that covered with something? Okay.
I've got that covered. I'm going to ask Richard here for his question.
Thanks for this, and hi. And I'll preface it by contextualizing that I worked for this city for 11 years, pre and post-amalgamation. And I guess my question, and in part it's contradictory to the last series of comments, is, has bureaucracy not always been politicized? Have has the bureaucracy, and in particular the senior bureaucrats, not always worked to please the mayor and council. While it's independent advice, I would really question this utopian model of providing independent advice. I think bureaucrats at all levels are really aware of who their political masters are. While they might not fear for their jobs, mostly because they're unionized, they've always been political. And so I guess my question is, and I'd like, I guess, Mayor Hall to start with the response, because you were there when I first started at the city.
Well, in my experience, senior staff have been very professional and have been seemingly very comfortable to give advice that they knew was not what I wanted to hear from them. I think that I cannot, I can remember early on council when the Commissioner of Public Works suggested that we not do recycling because citizens of Toronto would never recycle. We should look for engineering technology ways of dealing with waste. That was the professional opinion that council received, and clearly a very different position was taken in terms of support for many recycling programs. I think that everybody in a working relationship struggles with, to some extent, with the desire of the person at the top. But I don't think it was expected. And beyond the sort of the human, I think we got professional advice and sometimes disregarded that in council openly.
I think the word saying that senior staff was political is wrong. They were respectful. That's what they were. And so if they were giving an opinion, they were respectful, even though we might have different opinions. I remember it was 1973 when we said we're going to have speed bumps in Toronto. Whoa! Whoa. Public Works, oh, you can't do that.
I always regretted that vote.
I'm going to continue to play contrarian here. And I want to ask you guys, one of the arguments for this is the fact that, we don't vote for councillors the way we vote for the mayor. The entire city votes for the mayor, whereas the wards vote for the councillor. So why shouldn't the person who the entire city votes for have more power?
Yeah, could I just make a comment on the principle? Because the argument that there's politicization is true. People understand that. It's a balance. It's a melange. It's a question of what principle are we going to follow? The principle that says that it should be professional independence that we're hearing from. Give us your best provincial opinion, or professional opinion. Or does it not matter? This legislation says it does not matter. We're just going to say it's politicized, period. So it's at the wrong end of the clock, is what I'm saying. Try and hew to the principle. Don't give up and simply say it's all politics, doesn't matter. So that's why I started off my little 2 minutes tonight saying, go back to the principles. They're the things that are going to keep you warm. They're going to keep you being able to see it clearly. And then, are there deviations from that? Yes, there is. But don't give up on the principle. Work away at the deviations, would be my suggestion.
Aloysius.
So can I just jump in, Adam?
Yep, you go ahead. I'll find Aloysius. I found him. You go, David.
Well, can I comment on this thing? Well, the mayor is elected at large. Oh, I'm sorry.
So Just on the civil service, I think it's an important Canadian principle that the civil service is independent. You're quite right that the civil service pays attention to what council's wishes are, but that's not being politicized. That's, council are reflecting the will of the people. So I don't see that as illegitimate at all. Things did change a bit post-amalgamation, and, it seems to be forgotten, but if you want to read about a politicized civil servants, or at least part of it, go back and read the proceedings of the MFP inquiry. And that happened in our city. It's not some other country or other city. And some of the conclusions were that the relationship between some senior public servants and politicians went too far. And I think the City of Toronto Act had a nice balance, because what it said was essentially the public service is accountable to the city manager. The city manager is accountable to council through the mayor. And that brought in a balance where the mayor is elected across the city, so she'll be able to influence the agenda. But it made it clear that the public service was independent. And the mayor wasn't appointing senior public servants. And I really worry about that too, for the reasons that Ken so clearly articulated a few minutes ago. We don't need to go over again. So I'd push back a bit on the premise of your question. I think we've been lucky to have independent public services. They're not perfect, and sometimes politicians are frustrated with them. But the balance we had, where the mayor had some extra responsibilities because of their citywide office, but council was accountable. Ultimately, the public service is accountable to council and relied on for its professional advice. To me, that's the principle that David Crombie's articulating, and it's right.
It's funny, when I left City Council to go to Ottawa, one of the things you hear in Ottawa amongst politicians in particular is that be careful of the civil service. They know you're replaceable and your term will end, and they will wait you out and just not do what you asked them to do. And so you ended up with sort of a passive-aggressive civil service that would ignore political leadership. At City Council, if I was going to break a rule, I had to do it in public. Staff would tell me I was breaking a rule. I would argue why it's important to break that rule. And if I couldn't convince my colleagues to break a rule, I lost the vote at City Council, even as a city councillor. If you're asking which I preferred, I'd rather have it out in the open, where you're held accountable for what you are breaking as a rule or what you're supporting as a rule, but you're held accountable, as opposed to in the back rooms of Ottawa, where you can play this weird passive-aggressive game and see things never get done because the bureaucracy just slows things down and waits for a change. And they don't have to listen to political leadership. And I remember once with a planner saying, it'd be easier if we didn't have politicians telling us what to do all the time. I said, there's a name for a government that doesn't have politicians, and no elections, and no democratic input, and I'm not sure it's the one you want us to call you. And that was that. But Aloysius, sorry, I almost said it properly twice, but not once. But here you are, here's your question.
Thanks so much. Oh, whoa. Thank you so much, Adam. So my question has more to do with the democratic temperature, I guess, or the culture that will be affected by this new legislation. So I'm 23 years old. My demographic is already notorious for voting less and being less democratically engaged. And I think a part of that is we don't have as many connections with city council, city staff, with the mayor's office. Given how there's already fewer councillors now, as there have been, compared to where they were a couple decades ago, what advice, I guess, would you have to Torontonians, but especially young people, who or maybe aren't as comfortable writing a letter, picking up the phone to their councillor, but especially with this legislation, or seeing that even if they do, and their councillor actually goes forward and talks about, their concerns as a young person, be it on education or anything else, that effect will actually go somewhere if the mayor can just veto it. So I guess as former mayors in particular, what advice or what would you tell a young person who's looking to get democratically engaged but might be discouraged at seeing this legislation?
While you decide, Richard, ask the question. Richard.
I'm not clear in the question, so.
Well, I think the question is, what should people be doing at this point, given the situation?
Well, on this situation, I'll say it now once more. For me, at any rate, the battle's not over. I mean, the battle it will start again for sure, I hope, when the new council takes office after the election. And we've got to insist that the mayor and the council deal with this legislation to have the public understand where it's going with the strong mayor system. We didn't have the debate before. We can insist on it now, and we don't have to convince the province. We have to convince our own council and mayor, in fact, push the mayor to hold that debate on council so that we can hold it in public.
There,
Adam,
Yep. David, go ahead.
sorry, Barbara. Aloysius, I'd say in your broader issue of youth, while it's true that young people don't engage with politics, I've certainly found them not shy of opinions and deeply caring about issues like climate change. And my advice is to use your actions on the issues you care about, whether it's climate change, young people engaging with the city, public transit, cycling, whatever. I'm trying to think of what or inequality. If it's climate change, there's things you can do too. Use your voice, particularly an organized voice. It's really powerful if a group of young people says something. And finally, use your vote. In this election, people should be asking their candidates for council and the mayor, when council meets, are you going to vote to use the strong mayor system? Or are you going to vote to not use it? And I think if, young people organized and said that this system is going to exclude them even more from the power at City Hall, so the Board of Trade will have a voice, but city government won't serve the needs of young people, it's a powerful thing. And so, use your actions, use your voice, use your vote would be my advice.
Barbara?
well, I think all of us here have spent a fair amount of our lives demonstrating, speaking out, speaking in perhaps non-conventional ways. At the city, when Mike Harris introduced amalgamation, we demanded that there be a referendum. They refused to do it, so we did our own. There were parades, there were people meeting in basements, whatever, all over the city, and people speaking out and organizing. There are a lot of organizations in the city. I'm not a real social media person, but when I am there, I'm amazed at the number of people, groups of people who are getting together and talking about issues, things like Progress Toronto, whatever, a slew of organizations. So go out, listen to them. Go to, if you can, to meetings, public meetings at City Hall and see who else is there. And if you hear what people are saying that you agree with, go talk to them and arrange to come back together next time.
So my advice to young people is get together with 4 of your friends, so there's 5 of you. Go down to city council and start yelling and screaming and meetings and interrupting them and causing trouble. I don't believe there's
He knows
any
what
other
he's
way of
talking
dealing
about,
with
folks.
this.
That's what
And
he did for a living.
No, I mean, this is very serious. That's the only way you're going to make change. Obviously, if you've got more than 5 people, if you've got 20 people, you can have more of an influence. But I think you've got to go down there and you've got to get in that council chamber and you've got to start yelling and screaming, saying, you can't do that. You can't do that. Mr. Mayor, you got to get out of here. I mean, we're gonna be stuck with John Tory, who says he likes the strong mayor legislation. This is absolutely shocking. People got to go down there and start yelling at him very clearly. And if I was a young person, well, I sort of am. Anyway.
No, absolutely. That's what John did during his time on council. He made good trouble. He made good trouble in a way that produced a city, or good in the city. And I say that because mostly I was the target of all that yelling and screaming. And if you think I got these lines because I'm old, you're wrong. So, but his advice to you, sir, young man, he's absolutely right. You're at the right age. Go get him.
And I think we'll end it on that question, as all of the panel have had a chance to address it in their own way. And before we end, I want to ask a couple of quick questions, because there was a question that came from the audience member, and there is Robin Potts is here, who's a candidate, and she told me that she's had 4 all candidates meetings in the riding that I used to represent half of. I would have 4 in a week, I think, if I'm not mistaken. But I'm just curious as to how many all candidates meetings have you attended in this election so far for city council? Hands up. And how many mayoralty debates have you seen on radio, on television, or heard on radio, television? How many mayoralty all candidates meetings have there been in the city that you've watched start to finish? Hands up. 1. There is something that is disappearing, and that is the public discourse. And regardless of which side you fall on in this debate, and regardless of which side of the city boundaries you live on, whether it's an old suburb or an old city or an old borough, the lack of political discourse and public discourse around any issue, let alone the fundamental values of democracy, is a little startling. How many of you have received literature from more than 3 candidates in your home? I put out 6 in every campaign. 6 distinct pieces in a campaign, in a smaller riding, which is part of the factor because of the cost, but it's an issue. And that, to me, which has been spoken to by the panelists tonight, regardless of what level of government we're talking about, regardless of what political party or ideology or what issue you're talking about, that lack of a public discourse, to me, is just astonishing in a city that I grew up in, where I'd be at a meeting like this twice a week as a kid, let alone as a young voter, let alone as a tax-paying voting resident. And that,
Your dad was a politician, though, so
yeah, and me too.
that helps a little bit.
So with that, but just before we get to some thank yous, and I want to thank Dwight for being a great moderator tonight, and of course...
Thank you for having me. It's always a lot of fun. And can I say something quickly before I hand it over to you?
Yes, you can.
All I'm asking you folks is just to stay engaged. It's so incredible to see you here tonight. We're doing far too many stories on CBC Toronto about people being acclaimed because nobody's running against them, about low voter turnout. Engage, 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 vote, vote, vote. Get your 5 or 6 friends together, get down to City Hall. It is too important not to do it, so thank you.
And thank you very much. And so beyond Dwight, I also want to thank the folks who hosted us. When David Miller left politics, he said, the hardest decision you make is to run. That's not true. The hardest decision you make is when you leave. And what I found is that when you leave, it's even harder to retire because you start to work. And one of the places that I'm now spending a lot of my time is here on the University of Toronto campus at the School of Cities, which somehow I've always referred to as the School for Cities, but that's maybe my political bias. But the School of Cities, Karen Chappelle, as well as Ben Louis, who's here, Lara Muldoon, and Cassandra Olives, have all helped set this up tonight, and they've been great at organizing my thoughts, but more importantly, organizing all of you to be here. I also want to make special mention of the CBC, which has been sharing this on some of their platforms live, but we'll also be replaying some of it tomorrow in the news. Streamlined, there we go. So, but Laura Green is here. She's a producer there. As a former producer myself, they never get enough thanks, but thank you very much. You helped marshal the not just the host, but also what the CBC can contribute to a conversation like this as a great public broadcaster. And I want to also thank the Innis College staff who are helped keeping the lights on, running the cameras, doing the AV, all the sort of stuff that allows our voices to be a little louder, and with louder voices, change comes. And with that, I will say thank you very much. Thank you again to the former mayors that have graced our stage, and Art Eggleton. No worries. And as they were once given wise counsel by a Mi'kmaq elder, which is wise counsel, safe journey, and good luck. Thanks.
Thanks, Adam. Thank you, everyone.